people who see IQ as real and see that a lot of the mainstream narrative on race is BS, they naturally, I think, fall into this sort of immigration restrictionist
Mhm.
camp. But you don't. Can you summarize just the argument of why? Because yeah, the correlation between believing IQ is important and wanting to restrict immigration is probably like one. I mean, from what I see online. So can you just sort of explain how you could just
Mm.
believe in IQ, believe in even IQ differences, and then be in favor of open immigration policies?
Yeah, I mean, I think that correlation is probably more like zero point 0.3 or zero point 0.4, but among very smart people who are against immigration, then you see
Yeah, yeah, of course.
this pattern.
Yeah.
So, I mean, there's a few things to say. I mean, one, of course, is just to take out and get a good look at a global map of IQ. And what you'll see there is that we very strictly limit immigration, even from countries that have higher average IQ than us. So, most obviously East Asia. Right? So this is where you're like, well, why is it that you're trying to stop immigration from other places instead of being super enthusiastic about immigration from higher IQ
Well,
countries?
I think the argument there they would be just as a practical
Mhm.
just as a practical reality. Our immigration system now, and then illegal
Well, you
immigration.
remember what did Amy Wax say? Amy Wax just said, "Hey, they're
Everywhere.
voting Democrats."
He
So,
also doesn't like East Asian immigration too. I
yeah,
think that's the opposition to illegal immigration at third world is stronger than opposition to Amy. Although she first world immigration, but with Amy it's both. But oh yeah, go ahead.
right. All right. So anyway, that's just one thing worth pointing out is just look at the map. It's not true that all the areas that are poor and would likely send us a lot of immigrants are low IQ, although a bunch of them are. Right, yeah. Second thing is just basic comparative advantage. It is not true that people of below average IQ are of negative value. Right? It's one thing to say that people with low IQ have some additional problems, but saying that someone has some additional problems does not mean that their very existence is a negative. Charles Manson, his existence is a negative, but the janitor who works at your office, if he dropped dead, would you say, oh, it's a great thing for society that that
Like
janitor
we just remember.
died? I mean, now again, I think that there are some people would say, look, it's not polite to say that it was good that he died, but yeah, it was good that he died. It's like, well, what was good about it exactly? What was that guy doing that was so awful? He was, performing a useful function. And again,
Right.
remember that in a
Well,
world where
one thing
everyone is of the IQ of Einstein, then what is the IQ of the guy who takes out the trash? It's Einstein's IQ.
Yeah. So one thing I've seen a lot of people say is that they'll look at net tax burden. So they'll
Mm-hmm.
say the average person who's making 30,000, the average low IQ person, they pay a lot more taxes than they take it. I don't doubt that's true. Poor people don't pay a lot of taxes, and poor people get benefits. So how do you respond to that?
Right. So, I mean, I would start by responding and saying, look, you're not wrong. Right. It's true that people of higher IQ on average pay a lot more taxes. But again, even from a totally fiscal point of view, does not show that they are net negative, especially because so much government spending is what economists call non-rival, which means that its cost doesn't really depend on population or doesn't depend so much. So you need to go and adjust the numbers for that. And when you do, then at least in the US, it does not look like the immigrants that we are getting are definitely not large net negatives. National Academy of Sciences says that the average immigrant we get is actually a net fiscal positive. But the deeper point, as I think you've mentioned, Richard, is that looking only at fiscal effects is missing the main thing that people do, which is produce stuff. So yeah, that the janitor, like it may be that he actually is a modest net consumer of government services, even after we make adjustments for non-rivalry. But he also is someone who is producing valuable goods, which allows people who are of higher IQ to go and specialize in high IQ activities and then enrich the world and themselves to a greater degree. So again, this thought experiment of in a world of Einsteins, what's the IQ of the person who takes out the trash? It's an Einsteinian IQ. What a waste. What a terrible waste of talent. But now, the part of the immigration IQ book that I felt very proud of and most proud of was this. How much of the lower IQ that we see in the poorest countries is actually caused by environmental effects of growing up in extreme deprivation? I have a whole book on nature versus nurture based upon first world twin adoption studies saying that very little, if any, of the adult IQ gap within rich countries can be explained by the effects of growing in poverty. But it's important to remember this is a very restricted sample. So, what would we actually see if we would go and measure the effect of severe deprivation on IQ? This is one where As far as I can tell, there are just zero standard twin or adoption studies on this very point. But I did track down a bunch of high quality studies of the effect of transnational adoption on IQ. And in particular, these are usually ones that look at what happens when you go from the third world to Scandinavia, where they're really good at keeping data. And that data also includes the age at adoption. So we can go and compare kids that are adopted into Sweden from Ethiopia when they're 10 versus 10 days. The punchline of all of this is that at minimum 40% of the IQ gap between poor and rich countries is environmental, which should not be surprising because the deprivation is just so severe. Right? And essentially the method that I use is to say this. Assume that those kids that are adopted from the third world would have had the average IQ from their own country. How much better do they wind up doing if they are adopted at birth in Sweden? And that gives us 40%. And actually, that is probably an underestimate of how much gain we've got, because if you are in a third world orphanage, you're probably actually from a very poor third world family. You would have been well below your national average. So again, it could very well be that, say, 60 or 70% of the IQ gap that we see in poor countries really is environmental. People will then flip out and say, you're supposed to say 100. Like, I can't honestly say 100. So I'm not going to say 100. But again, if you care about IQ, just saying, look, we've got something that could go and wipe out half of that IQ gap, and it just consists in letting their family move to a rich country so they can grow up there. If you care about IQ, you should care about that.
Yeah. So you're increasing the global IQ. You're increasing the global phenotypic IQ by bringing people to first world countries. That's right. What about
increasing the phenotypic IQ, not the genotypic IQ?
Phenotypic. The other argument, I mean, the one that I struggle with a little bit more is what about crime rates? I mean, there are some countries where, in these Scandinavian countries, which they start out with very low crime, and the immigrants, they have a very high crime rate relative to natives. This is a cost, is it not?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and your language is exactly correct, relative to natives.
Yeah.
So here's the thing. In the U.S., it very much looks like immigrants have lower crime rates than natives. In Europe, it looks like they got higher crime rates than natives. There's a pretty simple story, which is that Americans on average have really high crime rates, Europeans have really low crime rates, and immigrants are better than us, but worse than them. But then when you look at how low severe European crime rates are, then it's reasonable to say, yeah, having double your really low crime rate just isn't that bad. It is a negative. It's totally reasonable to go and subtract it when you're thinking about what the net effect is. But again, to go and treat that as decisive is as crazy as saying that we don't want to have male babies because they've got 10 times the crime rate of female babies. Yeah. Dudes are violent compared to women, but most of us aren't going to kill anyone. Most of us aren't going to commit any severe violent crime. To go and say, let's get rid of them because they have this multiply elevated crime rate is an overreaction, even though the basic point that men are violent is sound. Relatively speaking, we're violent.
Yeah. I mean, I when you said that, if you double from a low base, that's maybe not important. I sort of think maybe it is, because I think there's a sort of a threshold level where you're basically a society with no crime, and then you get to be a society with some crime, right? I think there are some societies, say East Asia, where the crime is effectively zero. Like, I think in Korea, you could probably leave your laptop on the sidewalk and probably pick it up the next day. I mean, there's zero crime. So if Japan or Korea, let's say their crime rate increased by 50%, maybe it would be a bigger deal. Well, maybe not like, the US, if it increased 50%, it would be a lesser situation. But let's say US increased by the same absolute amount, right? So you add that to the US, it doesn't change much. Our inner cities are already, violent, war zones. But in Korea, it would be a big deal. So, maybe a Korean nationalist or a Japanese nationalist would say, we have something very special and fragile here, and we sort of want to preserve it.
I guess I'd start by saying, I get where you're coming from, but there is a standard way that economists have of measuring how much people actually care about crime. It basically consists in looking at rents in areas that are otherwise similar but have different crime rates. And what you can see is that people all around the world do not place anything close to an infinite value upon getting crime down to zero. I mean, honestly, I will say that right here in Fairfax, Virginia, where I am working, my worry about crime is already near zero. Like it's probably at 10 times at least what it is in Japan. But again, it's at such a rounding error level that I don't worry about it. I think hardly anybody does worry about it around here. To say that there'd be some immense value in getting from where we are down to nothing, and it'd be worth going and upending our society in order to do that, just seems quite crazy to me. I mean, and it's also one where I just don't see really anyone acting this way with their behavior. There are some ultra low crime areas of the US that you can move to if you really care about it that much. I just don't see much sign that these areas are places where many people actually want to move to. I mean, it's totally true people want to move from violent inner cities to suburbs. That's at a level where it matters enough. But once you're at the level of an American suburb, I just don't see that getting down to the Japanese level is all that important. Rather, I think that it's a typical symbolic issue where people claim that it means the world to them, even though their actions do not show that.